Every morning, at exactly 7:45 a.m., a gleaming black luxury sedan would pull up to the corner of 5th and Morrison, and from its leather interior, a woman's hand would emerge holding a crisp $20 bill, extended toward a young boy with dirt-smudged cheeks and eyes that held stories far older than his 12 years. But what Victoria Ashford didn't know, couldn't have known as she performed this daily ritual of charity that somehow eased the gnawing emptiness in her chest, was that the small fingers that reached for her money bore the exact same crescent-shaped birthmark that had once caused her to weep 13 years ago in a hospital room where she'd made the most devastating decision of her life. Victoria Ashford was a woman who had everything the world said mattered. A penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline, a company she'd built from nothing into a financial empire, closets full of designer clothes, and a calendar packed with galas and charity events where people competed for her attention. Yet every night she returned to her immaculate apartment and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the city lights, feeling a hollowness so profound it seemed to echo in her bones. A void that no amount of success, no level of wealth, no carefully curated social media post about her philanthropic endeavors could ever fill, because she knew what she'd done, what she'd given away, who she'd abandoned. The boy's name was Daniel, though Victoria didn't know that he woke every morning at 5 a.m. in an abandoned building 3 blocks from where she slept in Egyptian cotton sheets. Didn't know that he carefully washed his face in a gas station bathroom before heading to his corner with a small bundle of flowers he purchased wholesale with the little money he scraped together. Didn't know that he'd memorized her car, her schedule, her sad smile, and that he sometimes wondered why such a wealthy woman always looked so broken. It had started 6 months ago, when Victoria's driver had taken a new route to avoid construction, and she'd seen the boy standing there, small and alone in the morning cold, and something about the way he stood shoulders straight, despite everything, dignity intact despite his circumstances, had pierced through her carefully constructed emotional armor, and she'd asked her driver to stop, rolled down her window, and without a word, handed him money. And the gratitude in his eyes had been so pure, so without judgment or expectation, that she'd felt something crack inside her chest, and she'd returned the next day, and the next, until it became a ritual neither of them acknowledged, but both depended upon. Victoria told herself it was simple charity, that she gave money to many causes, that this boy was just another line item in her philanthropic ledger, but the truth, which she kept locked away in the deepest chambers of her heart, was that every time she saw his face, she thought of another child, a baby really, that she'd held for only 17 minutes before they'd taken him away, before she'd signed the papers that erased her motherhood, before she'd walked out of that hospital with empty arms and a shattered soul, told by her then-boyfriend Marcus, who came from old money and older prejudices, that she had to choose between her mistake and her future, that he would marry her and provide the life she deserved, but only if she proved she was serious about their future by letting the baby go to people who were ready. And she'd been 22, terrified, broke, and desperate to escape the poverty that had defined her childhood. So she'd convinced herself it was for the best, that the baby would have a better life, that she could forget and move forward. But 13 years later, here she was, still haunted, still empty, still punishing herself in small ways that no one else could see. One Tuesday morning, as Daniel reached for the money, his thin jacket sleeve pulled back, and Victoria saw it, a birthmark on his left wrist, shaped like a small crescent moon, exactly where her son's had been, in exactly the same shape. And the world seemed to tilt on its axis, her breath catching in her throat as if someone had punched her in the chest, and she heard herself gasp loudly enough that her driver glanced back in concern. But she couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stare at that mark as memories flooded back, holding her newborn son, counting his tiny fingers, tracing that birthmark with her thumb, whispering promises she wouldn't keep, and then the nurses coming, and Marcus outside the room, checking his watch. And the papers. Always the papers. "Ma'am, are you all right?" her driver asked, but Victoria barely heard him, because she was calculating, thinking, remembering her son would be exactly this age, would be 12 years old, had been born in this very city. And what were the chances? What were the impossible, astronomical chances that this boy, this particular child on this particular corner, could be? But no, it was insane. The world didn't work that way. Coincidences like that didn't happen except in movies, in stories, not in real life. And besides, she'd been told he was adopted by a good family, that he'd gone to a loving home, that her sacrifice had given him a better life. So there was no reason he should be here, on a street corner, selling flowers with hollowed-out eyes. "Drive," she managed to whisper, and then louder, more firmly. Drive now, because she needed to get away, needed to think, needed to breathe. But even as the car pulled away, she turned back to look at Daniel through the rear window, watching him pocket the money and return to his flowers. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she had to find out the truth. Victoria Ashford was not a woman who left questions unanswered or problems unsolved. She'd built her empire on information, on knowing more than her competitors, on digging deeper and looking closer. So she deployed those same skills now, with a desperation she'd never felt in business, hiring a private investigator that very afternoon, a discreet professional who asked no questions when she provided the details, a boy, approximately 12 years old, street corner of 5th and Morrison, and she needed to know everything: his full name, his history, where he came from, and most importantly, his birth records. 3 days passed, 3 days during which Victoria couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on her work. 3 days during which she still went to that corner every morning, but now looked at Daniel with such intensity that he began to seem uncomfortable, shifting his weight, avoiding her eyes, probably wondering why the nice lady from the car was now staring at him like he was a ghost. The investigator's report arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered in person to her office, and Victoria dismissed her assistant, locked her door, and opened the folder with shaking hands that had signed $1-million deals without trembling. And there it was, all of it, laid out in brutal, factual prose. Daniel Marcus Reeves, age 12, born at St. Catherine's Hospital on March 15th at 3:47 a.m. Mother listed as Victoria Ann Ashford, father unknown, placed for adoption at 3 days old, adopted by Margaret and John Reeves. Margaret Reeves died when Daniel was 9. John Reeves unable to be located, boy placed in foster care, ran away from 3rd foster home at age 11, currently unhoused, flagged as a runaway but low priority for social services. The folder slipped from Victoria's hands, paper scattering across her designer rug, and she made a sound she didn't recognize, something between a sob and a wail, because it was him. It was truly him, her son, her baby. The child she'd abandoned was the same child she'd been giving charity to, like he was a stranger, like he was just another nameless face in the city's poverty. And the bitter irony of it, the cruel poetry of the universe, bringing him back to her, this way, was almost too much to bear, and she crumpled to her knees among the scattered papers. Grief and guilt washing over her in waves so powerful, she thought she might drown. How had this happened? How had the good family she'd been promised turned into a dead adoptive mother and a disappeared father? How had her son, who was supposed to have the better life that justified her sacrifice, ended up alone on the streets, selling flowers in the cold, while she lived in luxury, built partially on the lie that she'd done the right thing? Victoria stayed on that floor for nearly an hour, crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry since the day she'd signed those papers. And when she finally stood, her face streaked with mascara and her carefully styled hair disheveled, she caught sight of herself in the office. Window's reflection, and barely recognized the woman looking back, not the polished businesswoman, not the composed philanthropist, but a mother. Broken and desperate and determined, she couldn't approach him yet, couldn't just walk up to a traumatized 12-year-old boy and announce surprise, "I'm the mother who abandoned you," because what right did she have? What possible right, after everything? And besides, he deserved better than that, deserved more than her sudden guilt and need for redemption. So she needed a plan, needed to think carefully about how to handle this. But she also couldn't leave him on that street corner another day. Couldn't watch him shiver in inadequate clothing. Couldn't bear knowing he slept in an abandoned building while she had 7 bedrooms. Victoria began slowly, carefully, first ensuring that Daniel had what he needed without knowing it came from her specifically. She contacted social services anonymously with his location, but followed up with her lawyers to ensure that instead of being forced back into foster care, a caseworker would be assigned to check on his welfare while keeping him placed in temporary supervised housing that she quietly funded, a youth shelter that was clean, safe, and actually staffed by people who cared. And she made sure, through various anonymous channels, that Daniel was offered a spot there, with no questions asked, no pressure applied. She watched from a distance as, 2 weeks later, Daniel stopped appearing at the corner, and her heart nearly stopped until she confirmed through her investigator that he'd accepted the shelter placement, that he was sleeping in a real bed, eating regular meals, even attending the shelter's education program, and seeing him slowly transform over the following weeks, his face filling out, his eyes growing clearer, his posture becoming truly straight instead of defensively rigid, filled her with a joy so profound it was almost painful. But watching from afar wasn't enough. Couldn't be enough, because Victoria had already lost 12 years, and she couldn't bear to lose any more. Yet she also knew that the truth, delivered wrong, could damage him further, could become another abandonment, another betrayal. So she sought counsel from Dr. Sarah Chen, a family psychologist who specialized in adoption and reunification, and in that office, Victoria finally spoke aloud, the full truth of what she'd done and what she'd found, and Dr. Chen listened without judgment before offering careful, measured advice. Daniel needed stability first, needed to feel secure and safe before any major revelations, needed to be prepared for the possibility of reunification before being confronted with it, and most importantly, needed to have agency in the decision of whether or not to have a relationship with his birth mother. You have to be prepared, Dr. Chen said gently, for the possibility that he may not want to know you, may not forgive you, may not be able to move past the abandonment. And if you truly love him, you have to be ready to accept his choice, even if that choice breaks your heart. Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face, because she understood, because she knew she deserved his anger, his rejection, his hate, but she also knew she had to try, had to give him the choice she'd once taken away. With Dr. Chen's guidance, Victoria began the slow process of entering Daniel's life properly, starting with volunteering at the youth shelter, showing up every Tuesday and Thursday evening to help with homework, tutoring, and she saw him there, working on math problems with fierce concentration, and he saw her too, his eyes widening in recognition. "You're the car lady," he said, and she smiled, heart hammering, and replied, "I am. And you're Daniel. I've heard good things about you from the staff here." Over the following months, Victoria became a steady presence in the shelter, not just for Daniel but for all the kids, though she couldn't help the way her eyes always sought him out, the way her heart swelled when he started voluntarily sitting at her tutoring table, the way she memorized every detail of his face, looking for herself in his features, finding her own eyes looking back at her, her late father's nose, her mother's smile. They began to talk, carefully at first, about school subjects, and then gradually about other things: his love of drawing, her interest in architecture, his questions about business, her stories about building her company, and She felt herself falling in love with this almost teenager who was brave and kind, despite everything life had thrown at him, who helped younger kids with their homework, who said please and thank you like they were sacred words, who was, against all odds, good. One evening, 6 months into her volunteering, Daniel stayed after the others had left, fidgeting with his pencil, and finally asked, "Why do you come here? Rich people usually just write checks. They don't actually show up." And Victoria felt the weight of the question, the intelligence behind it, and she knew she owed him truth, even if not yet the complete truth. So she said softly, "Because I made mistakes when I was younger. Because I lost someone I should have fought for. Because being here, helping you and the others, it helps me remember what actually matters." And Daniel looked at her with those old, knowing eyes and said, "The person you lost, do you think they'd forgive you?" And Victoria's voice broke as she whispered, "I don't know. I hope so, but I'm not sure I deserve it." The shelter director, Maria, who'd been informed by Dr. Chen of the situation, told Victoria that Daniel had been asking about her, wondering about her story, and that perhaps, if she was ready, it might be time to begin the process of disclosure. But it had to be done carefully, with professional support, with Daniel's therapist present, with every safeguard in place to protect him from further trauma. Victoria agreed immediately, terrified and desperate and hopeful all at once, and the meeting was arranged for a Saturday afternoon in Dr. Chun's office, which had been made comfortable and informal, and Daniel arrived with his shelter caseworker, confused about why he'd been brought here, but trusting enough now to come. And when he saw Victoria there, he smiled tentatively, still unsure, and she smiled back, tears already forming, though she fought to control them. Dr. Chen began gently, talking to Daniel about birth families, about adoption, about how sometimes people make choices when they're young and scared that they regret for the rest of their lives. And Victoria watched Daniel's expression shift from confusion to dawning understanding to shock. And finally, his eyes locked on hers, wide and disbelieving, and he whispered, "You." And she nodded, tears flowing freely now, and said, "Yes, I'm your birth mother, Daniel. I gave you up when you were 3 days old, and I've regretted it every single day since. And I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, no right to expect forgiveness or understanding. But I needed you to know that I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped wondering if you were okay, and that finding you again, getting to know you these past months, has been the greatest gift of my life, even though I don't deserve it." The silence that followed was devastating, stretching for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. And then Daniel spoke, his voice small and broken in a way it hadn't been even when he'd lived on the streets. "You're rich. You've been rich this whole time. You could have found me, could have checked on me, could have known that my adopted mom died, and that I ended up alone. But you didn't. You didn't even try. And I was sleeping in an abandoned building while you were in your mansion, or whatever. And you only care now, because you happened to see me, because it was convenient. Because," and his voice broke completely, and he was crying, and Victoria wanted more than anything to hold him, to comfort him, but she knew she'd forfeited that right. So she stayed in her seat, her own sobs barely contained, and said, "You're right. You're absolutely right. I was a coward. I told myself you were better off, that the adoption meant you had a good life, so I didn't have to face what I'd done. I built walls around that decision, around that guilt, because looking at it directly would have broken me. But that's not an excuse. It's just the truth. And the truth is that I failed you, Daniel. I failed you from the moment I let them take you from my arms. And I've been failing you every day since. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that, if you'll let me. But I understand if you can't, if you won't. If this is the last time you ever want to see me." Dr. Chen intervened, then, gently guiding the conversation, reminding Daniel that he didn't have to make any decisions now, that this was just the first conversation of many, that his feelings, all of them, including anger and hurt and confusion, were valid and important. And she asked him what he needed, what would help him process this. And Daniel, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, said quietly, "I need time. I need to think. I can't do this right now." And Victoria nodded immediately, standing, saying, Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready." And she left the office quickly, not wanting him to see her completely fall apart, and in her car, parked 3 blocks away, she wept with such force that she made herself sick, because she'd seen his pain, had caused his pain, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do to take it back. 3 weeks passed with no word. 3 weeks during which Victoria continued to volunteer at the shelter, but Daniel made sure to be in different rooms to avoid her, and she respected that, didn't push, didn't approach, just made sure the staff knew she was available whenever he was ready. And she thought perhaps he'd never be ready. Perhaps this was her punishment, to know her son and lose him all over again, this time by her own admission of guilt. But then Maria called her one evening and said, "Daniel wants to talk to you. Just you two. No therapists, no mediators. He says he has questions," and Victoria's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. But she agreed immediately, and they arranged to meet in the shelter's small garden, a quiet space with benches and overgrown flowers that the kids were slowly rehabilitating. Daniel was already there when she arrived, sitting on a bench, looking small despite his recent growth. And he looked up when she approached, his expression guarded but not hostile, and he gestured for her to sit, and she did, carefully maintaining distance between them, waiting for him to speak first, because this was his time, his terms, his trauma to process. "I looked you up," he said finally, not looking at her but at the garden. "You're like really successful. You donate millions to different causes. You're on lists of most powerful businesswomen. You built everything from nothing." And Victoria nodded, unsure where this was going. And Daniel continued, "And I kept thinking, how does someone who gives so much to strangers give up her own kid? How does that work? How do you care about people you've never met, but not about—" He trailed off, and Victoria took a shaky breath and said, "I cared. God, Daniel, I cared so much, it nearly killed me. But I was 22, broke, terrified, and someone I trusted told me that loving you meant letting you go, that I was being selfish by wanting to keep you when I had nothing to offer. And I believed him. I believed that poverty was the worst thing I could give you. So I thought I was making a noble sacrifice. But the truth is, I was a coward, I was weak, and I let fear make my decisions. And by the time I was successful, by the time I had the resources to find you, I'd convinced myself you were better off not knowing me, not being disrupted. And I used that lie to protect myself from facing what I'd done. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply, profoundly sorry." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then said, "My adopted mom, Margaret, she was nice. She really tried. She used to say that my birth mother must have loved me a lot to want me to have a better life, that it was the hardest decision a person could make." And his voice cracked. "And I used to believe that, used to think of you as some kind of saint, or whatever. But then she died, and I waited for you, this imaginary saint birth mother, to somehow show up and save me, but you never came. And I ended up in houses where people didn't care, where I was just a check from the state. And I ran away because, at least on the streets, I only had to take care of myself. Didn't have to pretend to be grateful to people who resented feeding me." And Victoria felt each word like a physical blow. But she didn't interrupt, didn't defend, just listened as he continued. "But then you did show up, kind of, not as a mom but as the car lady, and you were nice. Not like charity nice where people look at you like you're a project, but actually nice, like you saw me. And then at the shelter, you treated me like I mattered, like my thoughts were important, and I started thinking maybe you were what a mom could be like. Which is so messed up because you actually were my mom, and I didn't know it. And he finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were wet, but his gaze was steady. And he said, I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I even want to, but I also don't want to lose you again now that I know who you are. And I don't know how to hold both those things at the same time. Victoria felt something break open in her chest, something that had been locked tight for 13 years. And she said softly, you don't have to choose. You can be angry at me and still let me be in your life. You can take years to forgive me or never forgive me at all, and I'll still be here. I'm not asking to be your mom, Daniel. I know I lost that right, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be someone you can count on, someone who shows up, someone who doesn't leave. And she paused, then added, Margaret was right, you know. I did love you. I do love you. I just loved you badly, loved you in a broken, cowardly way that hurt you. But if you give me a chance, I'll spend the rest of my life learning to love you better. Daniel nodded slowly, processing, and then he asked, if I let you do this, be in my life or whatever, does that mean you want me to come live with you, in your big house? And Victoria shook her head, only if and when you want to. Dr. Chen says you need stability and choice, that you've had too much of your life decided for you by other people, so this is your decision, and whatever you choose, I'll support it, whether that's staying at the shelter, or moving into your own supervised apartment when you're older, or, yes, eventually living with me if that's what you want, but there's no pressure, no expectation, just options. For the first time since the revelation, Daniel's expression softened slightly, and he said, options are good. I've never really had those before. And then, after a long pause, maybe we could start with visits. Like, I could come over sometimes, for dinner, or whatever, and we could see how it goes. And Victoria's heart soared, even as she kept her expression calm, controlled, not wanting to overwhelm him with the intensity of her joy. And she said simply, I would love that. Whenever you want. As often or as rarely as you want. The healing process was slow, marked by advances and setbacks. By evenings when Daniel would come to Victoria's penthouse for dinner and tentatively explore this new relationship, and other times when the hurt would resurface and he'd cancel visits, needing space, needing to remember that he had the power to choose. And Victoria learned patience in a way her business career had never taught her, learned that love sometimes meant stepping back, giving room, accepting that she didn't get to control the pace of reconciliation. There were breakthroughs. The first time Daniel called her mom instead of Victoria, then immediately looked panicked, and she'd smiled with tears in her eyes and said, you can call me whatever feels right, whatever you're comfortable with. And he'd nodded, relieved, and later started using mom more regularly, testing it out, seeing how it felt. And there were also setbacks. The night he'd exploded at her about missing his childhood, about all the baseball games and school plays and birthday parties she hadn't been there for. And she'd absorbed his anger without defending herself, because he was right. He was absolutely right. And his anger was justified and necessary and needed to be expressed. Gradually, over months that turned into a year, then 2, Daniel began to truly believe that Victoria wasn't going to disappear, wasn't going to abandon him again, and he moved into her penthouse slowly, first keeping his room at the shelter just in case. Then finally, on his 14th birthday, officially making her home his home, and Victoria transformed one of her guest rooms into a space designed entirely around his interests: art supplies, a drawing desk positioned by the window, posters of his favorite artists, everything chosen with his input, making sure he knew this space was his, truly his, not something that could be taken away. They established traditions, Sunday morning breakfast, where they cooked together, Thursday evening movie nights, monthly visits to museums and galleries to fuel his passion for art, and slowly, the boy who'd been alone for so long learned what it meant to be consistently cared for, while the woman who'd been successful but empty learned what it meant to put someone else's needs above her own ambitions. To measure her life not in profit margins but in her son's gradual smiles, his increasing trust, his slow transformation from a traumatized street kid to a confident, young man who was beginning to believe he deserved good things. On Daniel's 16th birthday, Victoria threw a party with his friends from school and the shelter. Nothing ostentatious, despite her wealth, because she'd learned that what Daniel valued wasn't expensive things but genuine connection. And that evening, after the guests had left, they sat together on her balcony overlooking the city, and Daniel said, "You know, I used to stand on that street corner and look up at buildings like this one and think the people inside must have perfect lives, must have everything figured out, must never feel lost or scared." And Victoria replied, "I lived in this building while you stood on that corner, and I can tell you, I was completely lost, had nothing figured out, and was terrified every single day by the emptiness in my life." And Daniel nodded and said, "But we found each other anyway. Or maybe we found each other again." And Victoria felt tears sting her eyes as she said, "We did, and I know I can't get back the years we lost. Can't undo the damage my choices caused, but I promise you, Daniel, for whatever years we have ahead, I will show up, I will stay. I will be the mother I should have been from the beginning." And Daniel was quiet for a moment before saying, "You already are, Mom. You already are." Years later, when Daniel graduated from art school with honors, Victoria sat in the audience watching her son because he was her son, fully and truly, not just biologically, but in every way that mattered, give a speech about how art had saved his life, how it had given him a way to process trauma and pain, and how the people who believed in him had made all the difference. And when he looked directly at her and said, "Especially my mom, who taught me that it's never too late to make a different choice, to choose love over fear, to choose showing up over running away," she wept openly, not with the grief that had defined her for so many years, but with gratitude, with relief, with the profound joy of having been given a second chance she absolutely didn't deserve, but would spend her lifetime honoring. And she thought about that street corner, about the impossible coincidence that had brought them back together. And she chose to believe it wasn't coincidence at all, but grace, the universe's way of saying that some bonds, even ones we break, even ones we abandon, are strong enough to pull us back together, and that redemption, while never easy, while never erasing the past, is always possible, if we're brave enough to face what we've done, and humble enough to accept that healing takes time, takes patience, takes a love that shows up every single day, not because it's easy, not because it's deserved, but because some relationships, some souls, some second chances are worth fighting for, worth showing up for, worth rebuilding from the broken pieces into something that, while different from what might have been, is still beautiful, still whole, still sacred.